Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Okay, students, this is our second lecture on literary forms and movements. Students, in today's lecture, we are going to discuss some of the introduction of the history of English literature, uh, and then what is included in the literary history of English literature, and then what remains tradition or what becomes a canon. And we conclude this with the priorities of different ages. Students, England has a rich literature with a long history. This is an attempt to tell the story of English literature from its beginnings to the present day. The story is written to be read as a whole, though it can be read in parts, and its apparatus and index allow it to be consulted for reference. To be read as a whole with pleasure, a story has to have a companionable aspect, and the number of things discussed cannot be too large. There are said to be 9 and 20 ways of reciting tribal lays, and there is certainly more than one way of writing a history of English literature. This introduction says what kind of a history this is and what it is not, and defines its scope, where it begins and ends, and what English and literature are taken to mean. So, students, literature is a word with a qualitative implication, not just a neutral term for writing in general. Without this implication, and without a belief on the part of the author that some qualities of literature are best appreciated when it is presented in the order in which it appeared, there would be little point in a literary history. This effort to put the most memorable English writing in an intelligible historical perspective. In an intelligible historical perspective is offered as an aid to public understanding. The reader, it is assumed, will like literature and be curious about it. It is also assumed also that he or she will want chiefly to know about works such as Shakespeare's King Lear and Swift's Gulliver's Travels, the poems of Chaucer, Milton, and T.S. Eliot, and the novels of Jane Austen and Charles Dickens. So the major earns more space than the minor in these pages, and minor literature earns more attention than writing stronger in social, cultural, or historical importance than in literary interest. It is also assumed it is also assumed also that he or she will want chiefly to know about works such as Shakespeare's King Lear and Swift's Gulliver's Travels, the poems of Chaucer, Milton, and T.S. Eliot, and the novels of Jane Austen and Charles Dickens. So, the major earn the major earns more space than the minor in these pages, and minor literature earns more attention than writing stronger in social, cultural, or historical importance than in literary interest. Students, literary history can be useful and is increasingly necessary. Scholars specialize in single fields. English teachers teach single works. Larger narratives are becoming lost. The perspective afforded by general a general view is not widely available. Students of English leave school knowing a few works, a few landmark works, but little of the countries surrounding them. They would not like to be asked to assign an unread writer to a context, nor perhaps to one of the centuries between Chaucer and the present. How many thousands never heard the name of Sidney or of Spenser or their books, wrote the Elizabethan poet Samuel Daniel. This history offers a map to the thousands of people who study English today. University students of English who write in a final exam. Charles Dickens was an 18th century novelist, could be better informed. A reader of this book will gain a sense of what English literature consists of its contents, than of how this author or text relates to that chronologically and in other ways. Students, the map is also a journey, affording changing perspectives on the relations of writing to its times, of one literary works to another, and of the present to the past. Apart from pleasures of discovery and comparison, literary history fosters a sense of proportion which puts the present in perspective. Students, the historian of a literature tries to do justice to the great things in its tradition, while knowing better than most that classical status is quiet and can fade. As for literary status itself, it is clear from Beowulf that poetry had a high place in the earliest English, word that we can know about. The first formal assertion of the classical potential of writing in a modern European vernacular was made about 1307 by the Italian poet Dante. Such a claim was made for English by Philip Sidney in his Defense of Poetry, answering an attack on the theatre. Puritans closed the public theatres in 1642. After they were reopened in 1660, literature came to take a central role in English civilization. From 1800, Romantic poets made very great claims for the value of poetry. Eventually, the Victorians came to study English literature alongside that of Greece or Rome. So, students, literature has also had its enemies. The early Greek writer philosopher Plato, in banning poets from his imaginary ideal republic, acknowledged their power. The English Puritans of the 17th century, when they closed the theatres, made a similar acknowledgement. After 1968, After 1968, some French theorists claimed that critics were more important than writers. Some Californian students protested at about the same time that white European males were overrepresented in the canon. Students, a canon is a selection from the larger literary tradition. The modern English literary tradition goes back to the 15th century when Scottish poets invoked a poetic tradition with Chaucer at its head. As the Renaissance as the Renaissance went on, this tradition was celebrated by Sidney, Spenser, Shakespeare, Johnson, Milton, and their successors. Tradition implies participations and communications. It grows and fades, changing its aspect every few generations. When scholars first overlooked into English literary history in the 18th century, they found that the medieval phase was stronger and longer than had been realized. In the 19th century, the novel became stronger than drama. Students, in this way, writing and literature continue, as does the study of English. Since about 1968, university English departments have diverse field. Literary tradition has to contented with ideology and with research interests. Other writing in English had already come in. American followed at a distance by the writing of other former colonies. Neglected works by women writers was uncovered. Disavowing literature, cultural studies addressed writings of sociological or psychological interest, including magazine stories, advertising, and the unwritten texts of film and television. Special courses were offered for sectional interests like social, racial, or sexual. The hierarchy of literary kinds was also challenged. Poetry and drama had long ago been joined by fiction, then came travel writing, then children books, and so on. Yet the literary category cannot be infinitely extended. If new books are promoted, others must be relegated. and questions of worth cannot be ignored indefinitely. Despite challenge, diversification, and accommodation, familiar names are still found at the core of what is studied at school, college, and university. Students need to be able to put those names into an intelligible order related to literary and non-literary history. This semester, being a history of the 13th century of English literature, concerns itself with what has living literary merit, whether contemporary or medieval. Students, although this history takes things so far it so far as it can in chronological order, its priority is literary than that historical. Shakespeare wrote that so long as men can read and eyes can see, so long so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. The belief that literature outlives outlives the circumstances of its origin, eliminating as these can be, guides the selection guides the selection. Ben Jonson claimed of Shakespeare that he was not of an age but for all time. This distinguished characteristic is at odds with historicizing approaches which have sought to return literature to social or political contexts, sometimes with interesting results. Beliefs and priorities apart, not many of these 190,000 words can be devoted to the contexts of those 13th centuries. The necessary contexts of literary texts are indicated briefly and placed in an intelligible sequence. Critical debates receive some mention, but a foundation history may also have to summarize the story of a novel. Another priority is that literary texts should be quoted, but the prime consideration has been that the works chiefly discussed and illustrated will be the greater works which have delighted or challenged generations of readers and have made a difference to their thinking, their imaginations, or their lives. But students, who are the major writers? The history of taste shows that few names are oblivion proof. In Western literature, only those of Homer, Dante, and Shakespeare are undisputed, and for ages the first two were lost to view. Voltaire, King George III, Leo Tolstoy, G.B. Shaw, and Ludwig Wittgenstein thought Shakespeare overrated. Yet ever since the theatres reopened in 1660, he has had audiences, readers, and defenders. So continues a welcome has not been given to other English writers, even Milton. This is not because it is more fun to go to the theatre than to read a book, but because human tastes are inconstant. William Blake and G.M. Hopkins went unrecognized during their lives, nor is recognition permanent. Who now reads Ibrahim Coley, the most esteemed poet of the 17th century, or Sir Charles Grandison, the most admired novel of the 18th century. The mountain range of poetry, from Chaucer to Milton to Wordsworth, has not been eroded by time or distance, though a forest of fiction has grown up in intervening ground. Okay, students, see you in next class.